Okay. I still don't see a screen, but I'm good, I guess. Let's mute your mic while you do that. There you go. Now you can do what you want. Okay. All right. Well, welcome this afternoon to a conversation on racial equality. We've been talking about this for a long time, and I wanted to set it up with just a few introductory comments. So, one of the things I was asked, which was really a good question, is what's your purpose in having the conversations? What's your end goal? What's the point, right? Well, as is typical of me, I usually summarize things with 3 points or something like that. And 3 things came to me when I was asked that question. The first one was to listen. And what you're going to hear over the next 4 weeks is stories. Stories, not as much with Joel's presentation night, but to some extent, stories about people's experience. Their experience in a variety of different places and different cultures. In order to understand any issue, you got to listen, right? In other words, if I don't listen, my opinion about something is rather ill-informed because all I'm doing is thinking about my own thoughts. So first is listen. Second is learn. Second objective is to learn. So when I listen to someone, I learn something about them, and I learn something about myself, and I learn something about the world that I live in. So listen and learn. Second objective. Third objective is to discover. Now, that could go in a lot of different directions, but I'll limit it to 2 things. I would hope that as we listen and as we learn from the other, we will discover in a deep way something about ourselves, our hearts, and we will discover the image of God in the other. If we deeply discover the image of God in the other, truly discover the image of God in another, a lot of issues come into focus, and we understand better how to conduct ourselves. The Board of Elders is reading 2 books on this subject right now, and I wanted to advise one of them to you, not both of them. One of them to you. It's a very interesting book. It's called The Third Option, and The Third Option is written by a pastor of a multiracial church in San Diego, the largest multiracial church in the United States. And he suggests that when we approach these kinds of issues, there's another way to think about it, right? Instead of giving it away, I would advise, if you're interested in exploring more, that you look at that book. It's an intriguing book. It's an easy read. It's not intellectual at a high level. It's none of that. It's just a description of his experience as a pastor and how he's come to conclusions about the issue. So what are we here not to do? Here's what we're not here to do. We're not here to debate. We're not here to analyze certain particular theories. We're here to listen and to learn and to discover the image of God. I don't know where that leads us. I don't know what kind of conversations come out of this, but I do know it couldn't be anything but good if we actually use those as our guideposts, because that's what we're supposed to do as believers. So let me say one more thing, and then I promise I'll shut up. Joel and I were commiserating the other day, and he asked how long he should go, and he said, like you, I can just talk forever, so you need to give me a time limit. What I also want to say is something about how this plays out. So Joel tonight is going to talk about cultural humility. It's going to be great. The second night, I have a pastor friend from Gary, Indiana, who's coming in to be with us, an African-American pastor who's doing remarkable things in the city of Gary. Now, if you know anything about Gary, it's not the place where most people want to live nowadays. Ironically enough, his last name is Whitaker. Curtis Whitaker, and he's going to be with us. He's going to share his experience about who he is, how he grew up in Gary, Indiana. He came to Indiana University and went to the Kelley School of Business and is a CPA in Chicago for many years, and now he's a pastor in Gary. He's trying to rebuild the town that he grew up in. He's very committed to his community and very committed to the gospel. So he'll be the second person in terms of a presentation, and we'll have on that night more panelists. More people will be here to engage the questions. On the third night, our very own Marietta Simpson is going to talk. She'll be the presenter. She will present her experience, and we will learn from her. And then again, we'll have conversations. And on the fourth night, Joel's going to be back up. On the fourth night, Joel is going to be back up to give us sort of the wrap-up. And what he's going to do in the wrap-up, he's going to ask us, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Joel. He's going to ask us to actually engage with one another. Because the presentation he's done many times before involves feedback from one another, like at a table, talking about questions and things like that. So we'll wrap it up that way. So I hope you enjoy it, and I just thank Joel, and you're done. Thanks.
Hello? Hello. Okay, bye. Okay. Why don't we begin with a word of prayer? That's always a good thing when I'm nervous. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we just want to thank you for this opportunity to learn together, to seek your face. And I pray that you give us open minds and open hearts and a spirit of humility. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. It feels kind of surreal to be here on stage doing a live face-to-face presentation. The last time I did something like that was in February of 2020. And since then, I've been doing a lot of talks, typically wearing a jacket, a shirt, and shorts in front of a computer with a camera staring at me. So this is a lot more fun. I'm presenting on a topic that I've presented several times at IU. This is actually going to be my fourth presentation on cultural humility. And I'm delighted to be able to share some, with our church here some of the things that I've talked about at IU. And the fun part about it is that I can talk about other things and relate this to my faith in ways that I wouldn't typically do at IU. So, okay. All right. If we had more time, what I would ask you all to do is to take out a piece of paper and answer this question 10 times. Who am I? You probably don't have paper, but I'm guessing most of you have a phone. And if you're willing to humor me for a few seconds, you don't have to answer this 10 times, but you could, whip up and maybe answer this 3 times, 2 or 3 times. If you pick up your phone and, go to whatever app that you have for writing notes. I use Google Docs or whatever you like, and just answer the question. But here's the catch. You can't say I'm a Christian or you can't say I'm a child of God. All right, and I know that's true. It's not because I don't believe in it. Of course it is. But, we're in a church. We're all going to say the same thing. So let's take that out, right? So don't say that you're a Christian. Don't say you're a child of God or, all the great spiritual stuff that we all believe in. Answer the question, who am I? And I'll give us about 30 seconds. You can just do about 2 or 3 responses. Go with your guts. And I promise you I won't put you on the spot and ask you to share with the rest of us. Just in case you have something embarrassing, I want to ask you, all right? We'll come back to that. So, who am I? Who are you? Okay, I think most of you have about at least 2 or 3 of that, so you can write more if you like. Okay, I'm going to come back to that. I'll share with you some of my own responses to that question later, right? I promise you we'll get back to that, and I'll find a way, I'll figure out a creative way to relate this to cultural humility. Before we get into cultural humility, I wanted you to bear with me for a while because I want to talk a little bit about some broader issues that are related to, but not directly about cultural humility. I want to talk a little bit about race and racism. And then I promise you we will get to cultural humility. I just want to share a little bit about my background. For those of you who don't know me, my family and I have been worshiping at, I was going to say ECC and CCC for the last 14 years, since 2007. I am a professor at IU. My specialty is in counseling psychology. I do research in a variety of different areas, but some of the more salient issues related to tonight. So today's topic relate to race, culture, and gender. In terms of ethnicity, I'm Singaporean. I was born and raised in Singapore. Came to Indiana via Texas. And I also identify as Asian American. So I wanted to start by having us answer this question. Which is true? The United States has made substantial racial progress over the last 2 centuries and the last couple of decades, or racism continues to be a chronic and pervasive endemic problem in the United States. Right? You don't have to answer this question. But if you can guess, this question is a rather divisive question in the sense that depending on which political persuasion you belong to, you might lean in one direction or the other. By the way, these questions have been posed, and members of one major political party would lean in favor of the first, and members of the other major political party in the US would lean in favor of the second. So which is true? I'll give you the academic's answer, or at least the answer that Bob likes to give a lot in his sermons. I think both are true, right? I think you can make the case for both are true. Shall I make the case for the first one? And this is what I would say to my friends who are constantly talking about how bad things are in the U.S. And I said, as an immigrant, I could see things in the U.S. that you can't see if you're born and raised in the U.S. You have no idea how bad it is in some parts of the world. Countries where, because you are a racial minority, by virtue of being a racial minority, you are subject to genocide, that your life is unsafe. And not just you as an individual, but your entire group is unsafe. Your entire community is unsafe simply because of your race or ethnicity. I've got friends who came from countries where it is blatantly, explicitly okay to discriminate against persons of a racial minority group. It's even enshrined into the law. I have a friend who grew up in this place where they had racial quotas for university places in favor of the majority group, not a minority group, in favor of the majority group. He once went to a government official to ask about applying to medical school, and he said, "Are you of this race?" I was like, "No." "Well, why are you asking?" He ended up in the U.S., went to the University of Texas, and today he's an engineer in Dell Technologies, right? A country that did not want citizens of a minority race. To my friends who strongly endorse, who are rather very skeptical of the second statement that racism continues to be a chronic endemic problem, I would say I wish you could live 1 week in my shoes and experience the racism I experience. Me, live in my shoes. I wish you could walk in the shoes of my friends of color, my African American friends, my Latino friends, and witness and experience from their experiences the sum of struggles and racism they experience. And then try to answer that question again. And so I want to say that both are true. But maybe a better question to ask is not which is true, but if we're culturally humble, which perspective should we be open to? And with that, I want to suggest 2 ways to answer this question. And first of all, I haven't even defined cultural humility with yet, but bear with me, right? I'll get there. But let's just assume we're humble. I want to suggest to us that one way to answer that question as to which is more true or which should we focus on is which perspective have we been least exposed to? And I would say whichever perspective you have been less exposed to, that's the perspective we should try to explore and be more open to and learn more about and discover. The perspective we've been least exposed to is probably the perspective we need to learn more about. That's one way to think about the issue. The second way to think about this issue is which perspective would offer me the most opportunities for growth, for personal growth, right? So regardless of what I personally embrace, which perspective will help me grow as a person and develop as a person? And maybe that's the perspective we need to be more curious about. Okay? I want to start a little bit with Scripture, and then I'll go a little bit into race and racism, and I promise you I'll get to cultural humility. I'll start with the book of Acts. A very legitimate question to ask for many Christians is, why are we talking about race and racism? Isn't that something that divides us? Why not just talk about Jesus and me? And for that, I go back to Acts 6. It's a passage that many of us are familiar with. This is soon after Pentecost. You have the Hellenistic Jews and the Hebraic Jews. And almost immediately, right from the beginning of the church, you find complaints of discrimination. You find the Hellenistic Jews were complaining that the Hebraic Jews were being favored, and they were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. And a couple of lessons we can draw from this passage. The first is issues of ethnicity and race and discrimination have been in existence in the church almost right from the beginning of the church. It's not an issue that is new. It's been around, and the church has had to grapple with it. And I would like to argue that the author Luke inserted this passage in the Scripture because he knew this is an issue that's going to come up, right? The reason why you put things in the book of Acts is as an example of what to do and what can come up. So that's the first lesson we learned, that these issues are not new. They've been there right from the beginning. The second issue, which could be interesting, is notice that the way Luke describes this is that the Hellenistic Jews complained against the Hebraic Jews. Now, if you want to take a more critical view of this, you could say, wait a minute, there's no evidence that they were actually being discriminated against, right? Maybe the Hellenistic Jews were being oversensitive, right? You just think you're being discriminated. You're not actually being discriminated. You think you are. And the truth is, we don't know from the passage that we can't say definitively if that's true or not true. I like to think they were genuinely being discriminated, but we don't actually. The way Luke described it is from their perspective, they felt there was a problem. But what I find striking was the solution that the apostles gave to this. And that the apostles' reaction to this was not like, we shouldn't focus on this. Let's not focus on our linguistic divisions. Let's focus more on the preaching of the word. They were very concerned about the preaching of the word. But what I found interesting was the apostles appointed a group of 7 individuals to look into to take care of the distribution of food. And if you look at the 7 individuals, they all have Greek-sounding names. We don't know for certain, but my guess is that they were probably Hellenistic Jews, right? Hellenistic Jews were the Greek-speaking Jews. And so in response to a complaint about discrimination by a minority group, the Hellenistic Jews were probably the minority group there, the apostles appointed leaders. This is the important part. Leaders of that minority group to address that problem. I think that's interesting and something for us to think about. All right. I want to talk a bit about terminology. In today's lecture, I'm going to use the term people of color to refer to non-whites. I do want to acknowledge, as you can imagine, academics make a living out of making up words and terms. If not, you have nothing to write about. And a lot of different phrases have been used. I you can use any of these phrases and it wouldn't offend me. And some of my colleagues use other phrases like racial minorities, racially minoritized. You must like, why minoritized? That's going to take another 2 hours to explain, but that's a term that's been used. More recently, BIPOC with the Black Lives Matter. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color, really emphasizing the identities of Black and Indigenous people, right? Okay, I did click. Should I click again one more time? I got it. Is it going to move? Oh, okay. This clicker has a 10-second delay, and I'm pretty sure it's a spiritual test of patience. It's a fruit of the Spirit that I lack. All right. I'm going to try to talk about a little bit about racism. I promise you I'll get the cultural humility. But I feel like it's important to briefly touch on these. Now, each of these can take an hour's worth of lecture. So I'm going to speed through this in 2 minutes, right? And not do justice to this. But the way academics have thought about racism in the US is to acknowledge that there has been racial progress over the last 2 centuries. I personally believe that, okay? I want to make it clear. And that modern expressions of racism are probably very different from the racism you experienced, say, during the Civil War or during the era of slavery, and even different from, say, 40 or 50 years ago, right, where things are really bad. But they continue to exist, except that they exist in different forms. And so it's kind of important to understand now the way it manifests itself, okay? So hang in there with me, all right? Like I said, I'm not doing justice. I'm going to give you a quick overview, and we can talk more. You can send me an email. You can send me hate mail later after this. But let's start with the first. Systemic structural racism. You hear that sometimes in the media. What does this mean? This refers to racism at the institutional and cultural level. And so it's important to understand what it doesn't mean. Systemic racism doesn't mean that every individual in America is racist and that, everyone is rotten to the core. That's not what it means. It means that racism isn't simply an individual act by people committed, but that it is interwoven into the way of life, into society, into the way things are, okay? So that it exists in terms of institutional policies or practices. It exists in terms of expectations. It exists at the level of stereotypes that people have that just come automatically, or norms that people have, okay? So I would argue that if we're Christians, this is really easy to understand. It's kind of like a no-brainer because you can easily make analogies to sin, right? That sin, if you've think about sin theologically, it's not just an individual act that I do, but it also exists at a societal level, right? Embedded into the way society works, and sometimes the entire society. You look at the Old Testament sometimes, the entire nation of Israel was involved in sin, like idolatry. And so when you think of that analogy, it becomes a lot easier to understand how racism works at the institutional, national, societal level. I can give a ton of examples, but I'll just give 2 very, very brief examples. One, it exists at a level where, again, people do not intentionally mean it for it to be that way, but that stereotypes and norms are such that being American is often associated with being white. And therefore, someone who's not white becomes associated with being slightly different or being deviant in some ways. And he'll say, where's the research on that? I'll talk about that later. I'll give you examples of that, all right? And it's not something that any single individual intentionally planned for it that way. It just happens culturally. Second example, the police force. Now, I personally do not believe that the majority of police officers are actively and intentionally plotting evil against people of color. I don't. I really don't. Maybe some people do, I don't. All right? But what happens is that scholars and researchers have noticed that there are practices, policies that a police force has, police officers have taken that end up systematically discriminating against people of color, especially African Americans and Black and brown people, resulting in a disproportionate levels of arrests and disproportionate levels of police shootings that end up killing, or not just shootings, but end up police acts that end up killing African American individuals. Again, it's not necessarily that people are intentionally out to get African Americans, but what happens is that you have practices, pervasive practices and policies that systematically tilt in one particular direction that disadvantage African Americans. All right? Racism expressed as in-group favoritism. This one is a lot more subtle. And one way to understand this is to note that in today's age, racism in the form of out-group hostility is a lot less prevalent compared to, say, 40, 50 years ago. In other words, I think that if I were to guess, I would probably say that 95% of people in the United States do not have active hostile thoughts against people of color. You're not like actively plotting hostility against people of color. Now, there probably remain a few small minority of people who still do that, but the vast majority of people, and I would probably assume 99% of us here in Christ Community Church do not have that problem. And that's not the way racism manifests itself now. But in an article that really hit home for me, Greenwald and Pettigrew, and that article, when I read it, clicked because it wasn't just about the research. It spoke to my personal experience as a person of color. Argued that most forms of racism in the U.S. today comes not in the form of hostility, but in the form of in-group favoritism. So it's not that you're actively being hostile towards people of color, it's that you favor people of your own race. And that distinction is really important. So what do I mean by that? Like an example would be they conducted surveys where you ask white people, how negatively do you feel towards African Americans and white people? How positively do you feel towards white people and African Americans? And you find that, white people feel less negatively towards white individuals than towards African Americans, but the difference was not too much. The disparity was not too great. So in terms of active hostility towards African Americans, it really wasn't that big of a difference. The big difference came in how much you favor, how much you like, what positive feelings you have towards your own race. That among white people was at a much higher level than towards African Americans. And so Greenwald and Pettigrew argued, citing lots and lots and lots of studies, that how this show up is in very subtle ways. In ways such as the people that you choose to hang out, not in church or not in a workplace, but after work, after church. People that you pick up the phone and say, hey, do you want to hang out and have a beer together? Right? People that you want your kids to hang out with. Like people that you want to befriend. That's where the discrimination shows up. And the subtle aspect of that discrimination is that very often you can get away with it and nobody would ever know. Nobody would ever know because what you do in your evenings and the weekends becomes private. And so that discrimination often results in people of color feeling a little left out or alone or not having people, or feeling that sense of like people are afraid of me, which is often the experience of African Americans. That sense of like people don't really want to talk to me for reasons that I don't fully understand. They're not being hostile to me, but I get the sense they don't really want to talk to me. Okay? So the third form of racism that comes out in modern forms is implicit racism. And this one refers to racism that exists at the unconscious and automatic level, meaning that even when we consciously do not want to be racist, we say, no, I don't believe in racism, I believe in equality, I actively believe that African Americans and other minority groups deserve full respect. It exists at the unconscious and implicit and automatic level. I'll give some examples of research later. Okay. I promise you I'll get to humility, counter humility. Let's start with Philippians 2, which I think gives a really good definition of humility. Interestingly, Paul doesn't actually define humility in this passage, but he shows us what humility means. Philippians 2, verse 3, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. I sometimes get tripped up with this version of the NIV. I don't know about you. Raise your hands if you memorize scripture based on the earlier version of the NIV in the 1980s and 90s. Anyone? Yeah, that's me. In the 1980s, the version I memorized was, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility, consider others better than yourselves. You got that? You remember that? Consider others better than yourself. And I've always struggled with that version of it. It was like, well, am I supposed to think that I'm an idiot and other people are awesome? But I like this version, which is, it's not that you're supposed to consider yourself an idiot and other people are better, but I'm guessing the more accurate translation is that you value people more than you value yourself. You value people more than you value yourself. And the second part, not looking to your own interests. This is a higher bar. The older version of the NIV said, each of you should look not only to your own interests, but to the interests of others. The newer version says, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Really, the focus is on others, not on yourself. And then Paul gives an example of here's how you should do it. You do it by following the example of Christ, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God to be grasped, but took the form of a servant. So I really want us to think about this passage as the foundation for cultural humility. By the way, I couldn't talk about any of this in my 3 other lectures in IU. So it's kind of fun to be able to talk about this here. That we value others before we value ourselves. I mean, one practical example, which is one of those hard lessons I have to learn in my marriage, is there are a lot of things that Angie, my wife, values that I honestly don't really care about. I really don't care. I don't think it's important. I just think it's really not important at all. But it's very, very important to her. And one of those difficult lessons I've had to learn is that if she values it, then I probably have to value it too, right? That's what it means to value others more than you value yourselves. So this is a definition of cultural humility that's been given by a counseling psychologist, Joshua Hook. Interestingly, the psychologists who are studying humility and cultural humility, a bunch of them are Christians. I mean, they're doing work, secular research, but I've connected with them and found out they're all Christians. It's really fascinating. And Hook has defined cultural humility as a desire and ability to maintain other-oriented interpersonal stance in relation to the features of cultural identity that are important to others. Now, cultural identity, the word culture here refers to many aspects of your group, social identity, which could include gender and race and class, but here we're going to focus on race, right? So what's interesting is that even in this definition, like the passage in Philippians, the emphasis of humility is not just on yourself and how you should view yourself. It is about a particular interpersonal orientation. It's about how we relate to people, right? And so one of the ways we apply Philippians 2, 3-4 to the issue of cultural humility is to think about it this way, to say that maybe I don't really care about race and racism. It's just not something I think about. I don't wake up in the morning and think about my race. I don't think about racism. But I'm realizing that my brothers and sisters in Christ, who are people of color, care deeply about those issues. If you look at the Black church, Asian American churches, Latino churches, they talk about race all the time. And if they care about those issues, if I value them more than I value myself, not just about Christians, but if I value the people in this world more than I value myself, if I'm realizing that race is an issue that a lot of people care about, particularly younger people, and I value them more than I value myself, then maybe it's a starting place where I need to be learning more about this. I need to be more curious about this because I value people more than I value myself. All right? Okay. So why is cultural humility important? I want to argue it's relevant to people from diverse political orientations. I will get in trouble for saying this at IU, but I'll say it here. I do believe that sometimes people who are liberal, politically liberal, can be a little too judgmental when it comes to issues of race. When I present this at IU, some of my message to IU folks is, before we take the speck of dust out of someone else's eye, consider the plank of wood in our eyes. Like, look at ourselves first. We're not that hot, so I'm not that great, right? And to people who are politically conservative, my message is we could be too defensive, right? Too defensive. And this is dismissing everything. This is just nonsense, right? Liberal mumbo jumbo. I think either end of this political spectrum, I think cultural humility as applied to race is an important issue, right? We probably have something to learn, and we probably have something to learn in regard to our lives. So I've argued that cultural humility has 3 dimensions. I'm doing really badly on time. Should I speed up? Should I? Okay. Okay. I did warn Bob. I have a habit that I think Bob and I share. Okay, you know what I'm talking about, Bob? Okay. 3 dimensions. Let's start with self-awareness, right? And here I'm going to be talking about some really difficult issues. So self-awareness refers to our awareness of one's privileges and one's biases. Do you recognize these 2 actresses? Lucy Liu and Kate Winslet. Do you know which one is American? Lucy Liu's American. Kate Winslet is British. A bunch of psychologists have done a really creative study on this, and they use sort of a implicit association test to get people to sort of test their unconscious implicit association between these actresses, and their nationality at the unconscious implicit level. Okay, I'm not going to go into how they do that, but it can be done. And they found that even among white Americans who know that Lucy Liu is American and that Kate Winslet is British, they were more likely to implicitly associate her with being non-American and Winslet as being American. Does it make sense? And the article, if you want to Google and search for it, is they titled this article, Does White Equals American? Right? And the short answer is yes. This is, again, to me, one of the examples of racism at a structural level. It's not something that people consciously want to believe, but at the unconscious level, it's throughout society, there is a message that to be American is to be white, and to be white is to be American. I just want to say, and I don't want to talk about my experiences too much. I feel like I'm going to be stealing the thunder from the folks we'll be talking in the week after, and next week and the week after. But just really briefly, that's my experience sometimes. I don't experience a lot of active hostility from people. I just want to share, I've never experienced that here in this church. I feel so welcome. The form of discrimination that I experience is a lot more subtle and often comes in the form of, welcome to America, right? We welcome you. You're great, but you're not one of us. And it's a very subtle message. And sometimes I want to say, excuse me, I lived here in a long time. I didn't just get off the boat yesterday or off the plane yesterday. But often the subtle message that comes across in a variety of different settings is, we like you, we welcome you, you're not one of us. Yeah. So this is, you may have heard this been discussed. One of the privileges that's been talked about is white privilege. And it was just an uncomfortable topic, so I want to be able to talk about what white privilege is not, all right? White privilege is not something that is intended to make white people feel like you're evil or you're bad or you're so the word privilege is not intended to have a negative connotation, to mean that you are just a bad person. It simply means that by virtue of race, that white people have certain advantages in society. What are these advantages? You're associated with being American. You're associated with normality and associated with greater power, just being normal, right? And the goal of being aware of one's privilege is not to make people feel bad about themselves, but to foster greater empathy for people who do not have white privilege. So the recognition of privilege is the beginning of empathy for people who do not have that privilege. All right? So one analogy I can give about white privilege is to think about male privilege. And I know some of you are sitting here and saying, Joel, come on, there's no such thing as male privilege. Doesn't exist. And I'll say, before we go any further, when you go home tonight, talk to your family members who are women and ask them how they feel about that. One of the things I've had to learn, 20 years ago, I probably didn't realize this, was that when men speak up in professional settings, what we say tend to be given more weight than when a woman speaks up. It's something I didn't really know. I didn't really realize that until I talked to the women, my colleagues, and they tell me that. And once I begin to realize that, I begin to realize I've got certain privileges. And that was really helpful to me because I started noticing when women were talking among my colleagues, and I have a female colleague who talks, and then I got my male colleague who just slams in, interrupts, and takes over the conversation. If you're a woman, you've probably seen that a gazillion times. If you're a man, you may not have realized that happens, but talk to a woman. There's even a term for that women have described called mentorruption, when men interrupt women. But once I begin to realize that this is happening, then it helped me become better at stopping it. So, when that happened, I would say, sometimes when I'm conscious of it, I'm able to stop my colleagues and say, hey, hang on, wait a minute, Jack, I'm just making a fictitious Jack, right? Not this Jack, not Jack here. Jack, do you mind if we allow Mary to continue this conversation, right? But that awareness of the privilege I have made me a better ally. So I wanted to go back to this 10 I ams, right? I wouldn't get you to share what you wrote. But a question asked is, how many of us wrote, I am white? Oh, Bob, right, some of you are, right? Or I'm middle class. Oh, well, so we got your bunch of enlightened people here. Right? So I would argue that very often the areas of our privilege are the identities that we're least aware of. Right? That if you have a privileged identity, we often do not wake up in the morning thinking to ourselves, wow, I'm white. Oh, wow, I'm middle class. Oh, wow, what does it mean to be? How many of you wrote that I'm able-bodied? Right? But I assure you, if you are disabled, if you have some disability, that sense of disability is a very important identity. It's something that you become very, very, very keenly aware of. Right? So what I've learned is that the privileges that we have are often invisible to us. It's visible to other people, it's invisible to ourselves. I'll give you some examples. In America, what does the term NBA stand for? National Basketball Association. But who plays in the NBA? It's just people? It's men, right? What about the women's? What do they play in? They play in the WNBA. You see that? You see where I'm going? That the group that has the more power and privilege typically has greater invisibility. The word men is dropped. It's just called NBA. It's the women's NBA and the NBA. When we talk about American culture here in American society, what do we really mean? And I would argue that when we say American culture, what we really mean is white or European American culture. We drop the word white or European Americans, it becomes invisible. And so privilege confers invisibility. Privilege also confers ignorance. Ignorance in the sense that people with privileged identities tend to be less aware of the disadvantages that others have, but we become very aware of our disadvantage related to our oppressed identity. So if you are not middle class, if you are disabled, if you are poor, we become much more aware of those areas related to identity, but we become invisible to our privileged identities. Okay. A couple of years ago in 1989, Peggy McIntyre wrote an article. You just Google this person and you can find this as a long list of white privileges that people have. And this is a white woman, by the way. This is not someone who has an axe to grind. This is a white woman this reflecting on her own privileges. And I've just given an excerpt of the types of privileges that McIntosh described. I added one at the end of the process, and that's a privilege I have too, but it's a privilege that I know many black and brown individuals don't have. And it is, I can walk on the streets without worrying that I might be hurt or killed by the police because of my race. Okay? So self-awareness involves awareness of your privileges. It also involves awareness of our biases. And so change begins when we start to acknowledge that all of us have racial biases, and in some ways, racism infects all of us. And that's a difficult message to accept for many Americans, right? Because we want to be able to think of ourselves as good people. But I'll make the case that it's actually a message that's very easy for Christians to accept, right? Because if you are a Bible-believing Christian, as I think most of us are in this room, we often take the premise, we start with the premise that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. If you're a Calvinist, like Dan Wall is, and I'll be a Calvinist for today, we believe in a total depravity of human nature, right? And so the idea that sin is all around and racism is all around shouldn't be a shock to all of us. Right? How does this work? If you have never tried this before, go Google the implicit association test. And there you can try out a psychological test to test your biases at the implicit level. And there are all kinds of tests you can do. Tests against biases against Asian Americans, African Americans, against different types of individuals, male, female, etc. But here I'm going to focus just on race. And just to make you feel a little bit better, if any of you feel a little defensive and you take the test and you immediately think the test is bad and all that, I want to say the first time I tried this test, the test told me I had a bias against African Americans. I felt horrible. Okay, if it makes you feel any better, many African Americans who take this test show the same result. They show that they have, at an implicit level, a bias against African Americans in favor of whites. How do you explain that? Okay, that's a lecture by itself, but we call it internalized racism, all right? Where societally, the message has been sent in a very subtle way that white is better, and that's a message that's also been internalized by some African Americans, okay? But if you take the implicit association test, it's very humbling. It shows that at the implicit level that many of us have racial biases. And this explains why people who are good and who think of themselves as good sometimes do horrible things, right? Like mistake an African-American man who's walking down the street for a criminal or someone's about to shoot them. And it's like this person wasn't holding a gun because it exists at implicit level. All right. Now, here's the part that, oops, did I felt like I had one more slide. Okay, here. Now, here's the part that is really interesting. If you think of racism as having two different levels, racial bias at the implicit level and racial bias at the explicit level. Now, imagine that you are someone at the explicit level who doesn't believe in racism. You believe in racial equality, you think all the good things. But at the implicit level, it shows you have a racial bias. What the research shows is that this combination of high implicit bias and low explicit bias is actually the worst possible combination. You hear what I just said? I'll repeat that. Having low explicit racial bias, meaning that you believe in racial equality, combined with high implicit bias, is actually worse than having high implicit bias and high explicit bias. You know the people out there, the downright racists who are spouting racist rhetoric? The people with the low explicit bias and high implicit bias, that's possibly the worst possible combination. And how do we know that? How do researchers know that? They get people to interact with African Americans, white individuals, and they find that the African Americans, they asked the African Americans, how do you feel about these people who interacted with? And the African Americans found that the people they were most uncomfortable with were those with that exact combination. Low explicit racial bias, high implicit racial bias. And researchers term that term aversive racism. I think this is really, really humbling. What this means is that the more we deny that we are racist, the more we deny our own racial bias, the more we're at risk of causing harm. And that's one of those really, really humbling lessons. And so I want to argue that the first step in change could be acknowledging that we all probably have racial biases. Okay, I want to move on. I'll go really fast. I talk about inward dimension of self-awareness, be aware of our biases, be aware of our privileges. An outward dimension is valuing other people's culture and racial identities, and doing it in a way with curiosity and genuine desire to understand people's experiences. That includes an attitude of not knowing, of willingness to admit ignorance and to ask questions, and being able to empathize with other people's racial experiences. And here's how to do it. Probably one of the most inappropriate ways to do it is to tell people, oh, I know what it's like for you to be black or Asian. I know what it's like because I grew up poor. All right? And it's presuming that the experiences are equivalent. Okay, I will move fast. A better way to acknowledge that empathy is to say, you know what, I actually have no idea. I can't fully imagine what it's like for you to experience racism. And I would argue that it's probably a more culturally humble approach to expressing empathy. So in other words, saying, I have no idea what it's like for you to experience, help me understand, right? Other dimensions of valuing others, practice inclusion. As I said, remember the research on in-group favoritism, that most forms of racism today exist not in the form of active hostility, but in the form of we favoring our in-groups. So if that's the case, then we need to go out of the way to be inclusive, to reach out, to befriend people who are different from us. Solicit feedback from other people, like, hey, something that I just said, I don't know if what I said was offensive or inappropriate, insensitive. Give me some feedback, let me know. Be an ally and advocate for people of color, meaning like be someone to stand up for and fight for their rights. Be gracious to others who make mistakes. I do share that, I emphasize that with IU. I think being gracious is very important. And I share with my friends in IU that when people make mistakes and they're sorry about it, we should try to be gracious rather than condemn them. Right? So if you said something that was maybe racially inappropriate, I think we can learn to be gracious and learn from each other. Okay, I'm going to end soon. The third dimension of cultural humility, an upward dimension. And I want to think of cultural humility as a lifelong journey where we continue to grow and become better, and we'll always continue to learn for the rest of our lives. In fact, I've argued that cultural humility is probably inversely correlated with our perceived cultural competence, which is the more we think we know, it was like, oh, I know all this stuff, probably the less culturally humble we are. I mean, this is a message I share a lot with IU folks who sometimes think they know a lot. It's like, I know everything about race. I say, the more you think you know, the less likely we are to be humble, right? One of the ways we can practice this attitude of continually growing is to seek out learning opportunities, attend workshops, read books, and learn about the areas of our privileges. I'm sure many of us have oppressed identities that we know a lot about, but focus on our identities that are privileged. My other suggestion and challenge is that one of the best ways to break down prejudice is what's been called the intergroup contact hypothesis, which is that developing authentic egalitarian friendships is probably the single best way to break down prejudice. So that's something we should do. Whoops, did it move? I shouldn't press, right? But I want to end with, self-awareness, valuing others, and growth. 3 dimensions of cultural humility that I want to encourage us to embrace. It's 4 o'clock, and I'll end with a confession. So you all know I'm a professor, and a couple of weeks ago, someone asked me, what do you do for a living, Joel? And I said, I sit around and dream about stuff. And of course, the person thought I was joking, but I realized, I was kind of half joking, but I realized that I'm kind of not completely joking. That's what professors do, right? We sit around and dream about stuff. And I'll just confess, and here's I'll call it a sin, all right, on my part. I am really good. I am phenomenal with coming up with ideas. I am terrible in applying ideas to my own life. I do research on stuff. I teach about it. I do research on gratitude, by the way. And I've told my students, I think you are better at practicing gratitude. I do research on gratitude, you practice gratitude. So I'm a terrible person when it comes to application, all right? I hope none of you are like me. But if you are like me, right, then I want to challenge us with an exhortation that Pastor John Maxwell, leadership guru, has said. And that is that good ideas, good intentions, good decisions are not good enough. We need good actions. And so if anything I said has made sense, right, I really want to encourage us over the next couple of weeks not to just sit on them and think about them, but to find some practical ways to practice and apply them, not tomorrow, but today. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Don't have a mic.
Sorry. And sorry, Bob, I was aiming to end at 3:45, but went a little bit over time. A little bit like my senior pastor. Sure. Okay. Adam is going to control it. You want to move back one more slide? Oops. Wait, let me go back one more. Nope, one more. Yeah, I wanted to, one thing I didn't really mention, there's a website called betterallies.com, and it's really a list of tips that they send you every week, like tips on how to be a better ally, and it's focused mostly on women in the workplace, but also partially on how to be an ally to people of color. And I personally subscribe to it. Every week I get 5 tips, and I find them to be helpful. Right. Sorry.
Thanks. So, Joel, I really appreciate what you had to say. I think it hit everybody. If it didn't, they were asleep or dead, because it was good. There's only one thing, that story you gave about Angie and not always understanding her perspective. I don't understand that story at all. I mean...
Doesn't happen to you?
No, it's never happened to me.
Okay.
I always understand my wife's perspective, and I love exactly the same thing as she loves, so I need to work on that. Okay, it's a joke. It's a joke. Okay. What kind of questions do you have? I'm going to repeat them so people out there who are watching can hear them. So it's time to ask Joel questions. Say them loud enough that I can hear them, and I'll repeat them. None? Yes, Stephen. Not very well.
Sort. I think you could.
How
I'm
about
fine? Yeah.
if I pass the mic around? All right, here.
Hello. Okay, so Joel, thank you very much. I really appreciated all that. With regard to the practical aspect, I know sometimes I think to myself that this sort of stuff is important. I realize I've learned, after making it almost 40 years, finally learned about the fact that I have privileges as a white man. And so I've been thinking about these things more in the last really just year or two. And when I think about what can I do practically to make friends outside of my racial group, I always get a little bit anxious about it, because I feel like I don't want to go to someone and say, hey, I want to be your friend because you're
Right.
African American,
Right.
or because you're
Yeah.
Asian American, or whatever.
Yeah.
So should I feel that concerned about it, or what's the best way to kind of to try to do that practically?
Yeah, no, that's such a good question. This is actually I've had the same question brought up in many of the talks I've given in IU, and it's a very, very valid and difficult, valid concern and sensitive issue. I guess what I'm hearing, what you say, Stephen, is what you probably don't want to do, which is, I think you're right, is to come across as if like I'm targeting you because of your race. Like, hey, you're black. I want to be your friend. um, and the other thing that can be potentially problematic, which is I've learned, is that if you only have one black friend, there's a danger of that you interpret the person's experience as representative of all black people, right? And so very often you really need a diversity of friends before you begin to see how two black individuals are actually very different in some ways. They're similar in some ways and different. So I think the answer I've given to this is instead of saying I want to target certain individuals to be my friends, which sounds a bit awkward, we can frame it. We can set a slightly lower bar to say, I want to go out of the way to get to know people outside my immediate circle better. So it's a slightly lower bar. So it's not like I'm targeting you to be my friend, but to say I want to get to know you better. And yes, it might mean to say that, I have this person at work or this person that I in church or this person I know in my sort of outer circle, I like to get to know this person better. And just saying, hey, would you want to hang out with me for dinner one day, right? Um, and I think we do that, and you're not telling this person, hey, I want to hang out with you because you're Asian American, right? They say, I just really want to get to know you better. Just realize I don't really know you better. I think that strikes to me the right balance, right? Of being very intentional about it, but not in a way that's sort of in your face and tells you the only reason why I'm doing it is because of your race. Yeah.
Any other questions? Raise your hand quickly. I'll come to you. I know some of you have questions, but you're just too shy to put them out there. So, yeah.
Joel, thank you very much for this presentation. I think what you had shared was a lot of sort of the racial inequality that exists in the U.S. or even in Bloomington is not a result of individual level racism, but more structural level racism. And so then the solution wouldn't be necessarily an individual level solution, but more of a structural level solution. And I'm curious what ideas you have at a structural level to address the structural level causes.
Yeah. That's a good question. My personal view that it's both individual and structural. So I did mention structural. At the individual level, I said people continue to have implicit levels of racial biases, and at the individual level, I would argue that most forms of racist discrimination come out in a form of in-group favoritism in more subtle ways. So therefore, there are things that we can do at the individual level. As I said, if we begin to recognize that whether it's conscious or unconscious, and I would argue it's mostly unconscious, we tend to favor people who look like us. It's not something we plan to. Then we can try to override that sort of unconscious template by saying, all right, I don't typically think of asking someone out who's this person for dinner, but I'm going to make a more conscious effort. After church, I don't typically think of wanting to go out with this person, but I'm going to be making more conscious. So I think there are things that we can do at the individual level. Or in a meeting, if I notice this person is being quiet or nobody's paying attention to what this person's saying, I'm going to make an effort to draw this person out and say, hey, I think this person hasn't had a chance to speak up. Let's try to listen to what they have to say. So things that there are some things we can do at the individual level. At the structural level, I want to acknowledge it is a lot harder for that to be changed immediately, because some of it may involve political change, some of it involves policy, some of it's a lot slower. And of course, this gets a little bit more uncomfortable for some people in terms of political persuasion. But I think one of the things that we can even do that we can be helpful in at the structural level is yes, at the national, at a societal level, at a state level, this may involve political involvement, but there are things we can do within our organizations, like within this church, right? Within IU or wherever your workplace is, there are things that we can do to make the environment more inclusive, more open, like actively advocating for policies that are more inclusive. Yeah. So that's something that I would encourage us to do.
Another question?
Yes, Sam.
So let's say you're right about the difficulty at the more systemic level. If people have been privileged, then sometimes what that requires is people of privilege to give up their privilege or to diminish their privilege. And what I find is it's always easier for me to suggest that somebody else give up their privilege than I give up my privilege. So when I think about that systemic piece of it, I'm curious about, when you talked about starting at IU or starting here at the church or someplace smaller where we might have an impact, what one does if say, okay, I think this needs to change, and then you find yourself kind of having some backlash to think, well, yeah, I think it ought to change, but I didn't realize I was going to have to give this up, or I'm going to have to lose some privilege if somebody else is going to get some privilege.
Yeah. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. It's something that I see is a challenge, and it's a struggle. I'm trying to be a bit vague here because I recognize this is recorded on YouTube. But let us say in certain organizational contexts, I've seen that there is a desire to want to diversify, for example, the leadership. But then once the leadership is diversified, there's a discomfort with having to give up some power and privilege, right? So there's that tension there, where I want to be able to do good, but then if it means that somehow I have to give up something, I'm uncomfortable with that. So that's, yes, I've seen that push and pull that has been there. Yeah, it's one of my friends have said that if we truly believe in the cause of racial justice, it has to be at a level where we're willing to have it hurt personally. Yeah. And I recognize that's hard for many of us.
Any others? We don't want to keep you too long, but we also don't want to cut off questions. So, Steve.
Maybe just a little bit related to Sam's point. Great job. Appreciate what you, the discussion, just the structure, the way you're kind of thinking through it, giving framework for that, the language and so forth. It's just very helpful in trying to think about a very difficult issue. And I guess when you think about that, language is so important. So when you talk about privilege and the importance of privilege, those who are the beneficiary of that, really the challenge and need for them to exercise empathy is so important. And the way you described it, for me, just spot on. The need for empathy and dealing with the issue that Sam brought up as well. The thing that can also be challenging is when a term like privilege, I think, gets hijacked, and for some people have now ascribed, that term privilege takes on such a negative connotation.
Yeah.
And to the point where it can make people feel defensive.
Yes.
And then that's counterproductive to the whole discussion.
Yeah, no, it's you made a really good point. When this issue of privilege has been discussed in, diversity courses or workshops, sometimes the reaction that people have is, what do you mean by privilege? You have no idea what it's like to grow up poor, dirt poor. I grew up in Appalachia, you have no idea what it's like. I grew up in an abusive environment, terrible oppression from my family, or I grew up with a severe physical disability, and that's been a source of oppression for me, not privilege, you know. So I think, I mean, if I had more time, if let's say we're having a workshop and a discussion of that, my response would be to acknowledge all of that and to empathize with all of these other areas of oppression or of severe adversity, and not to minimize it at all, you know. And the argument I would make, I mean, I focus here only on white privilege, but I personally think that all of us have privileges, and all of us have probably areas of pain and disadvantages. It's both, right? And so the way I help people understand privileges is to help them, is to affirm their disadvantages and say what the pain that you go through or whatever you have is valid, and I don't want to take that away, right? And because you have those disadvantages, you can see how other people are privileged. If you have grown up in an extremely abusive family environments, you can see those people who grew up with good families. You can say that they have privileges that you didn't have. And does it give you a glimmer, a sense, a window into what it is like, analogously, to have privilege or not have privilege in terms of race? So that's the way I frame it. To say all of us have privileges, race is not the only one. There are many other privileges, and all of us have disadvantages. Race is not the only one. Yeah. But we can draw analogies from our experiences.
Let's take 2 more questions if there are 2 more questions. We're at 4:16, 17, whatever. Any other questions? Yep.
Hi, Patty.
Coming to you, Patty. Hang on.
I'm just curious, have you had a chance to do workshops like this in other countries? And is this the same kind of dialogue worldwide, or is it isolated to the United States or Western culture?
Oh, that's such a good question. And this is the 4th time I've done this presentation, and I haven't had that question yet. It's a really good question, and short answer is no, I've not had a chance to do a workshop like this in another country. Well, I haven't left the country in the last 1.5 years for reasons that you might know why. And I've always wondered what that would be like. One of the things that has been humbling for me is to learn about how other countries approach race and diversity. And the short answer is that it's done very differently in many ways. Sometimes good, sometimes worse. Sometimes better, sometimes worse, and sometimes just different. I can't tell if it's better or worse. It's just different. So I honestly don't know the answer. Some of the things that I talk about would, if I imagine in other countries, to be like, what? Wait a minute, what are you talking about? Now, with that said, I would like to guess, and I don't know if I'm right. I like to guess that cultural humility, just as an attitude or as an orientation, is something that is probably applicable across many different cultures and countries. But the way that manifests itself in terms of the actions that you take might differ across countries and cultures. But I need to think more about that question, so thank you, Patty.
One more, maybe? Anybody? Okay. You've answered all the questions, Joel. We have no further questions. We're completely informed. Now we need to take action. So, thank you very much. Let's give Joel a round of applause again. We do hope you'll continue this conversation with us 3 more weeks in a row on this topic, different presenters, different conversations, but we thank Joel for doing what he did. And I'm sure, he didn't ask me to say this, and he might not like it. He'll stick around as long as you want him to, if you want to ask other questions. Is that right? Yeah. All right. Good night. Thank you. Yeah, Rick. Yeah, he wants to know if he can have access to PowerPoint. You'll have to talk to Professor here, yeah. Yeah, send it to Dan. I'll send it to Dan. He's going to send you the PowerPoint, Dan. All right.